Hello, BISC132. This is the beginning of recorded lecture 5.5, the final recorded lecture in the quarter. Starting off here with the last chapter in the quarter, the endocrine system. So we need some review first. This is going to involve hormones, and I need to bring up the definition of hormone back from chapter 3, I believe. It's in the key terms again for this chapter. A hormone is a chemical signaling molecule, usually protein or steroid, secreted by endocrine cells that act to control or regulate specific physiological processes. So basically, it's a signaling molecule. Cells make it and send it out to send a message. So hormones can vary widely in their structure. Again, it's just a signaling molecule. Hormones can be lipid-derived hormones. So this means they are derived from cholesterol, basic backbone here, this type of structural steroid. And then here's testosterone and estradiol, which obviously you can see the similarities here, derived from this cholesterol. So this is one of the ways to structurally have a hormone. So they can be lipid-derived hormones derived from cholesterol. One example, again, there are a lot of these, I'm only using a few examples here, of a lipid-derived hormone is estradiol. You could also have hormones derived from amino acids. So here's tyrosine and tryptophan. These are two amino acids. And there's epinephrine and melatonin. You could see the connection here, how this is derived from this. So these can also be amino acid derived hormones from amino acids. And melatonin, a hormone involved in regulation of sleep cycle, is an example of an amino acid derived hormone. And finally, we can have peptide hormones. So peptide hormones are short strands of amino acids or long strands of amino acids, also known as proteins. So all three of these are much larger than either of these types of hormones, but these protein or polypeptide hormones are just another way to have a signaling molecule like this. Peptide hormones are proteins and short chains of amino acids. Insulin, which we're going to talk about more in this chapter, involved in blood sugar regulation, is a good example of a peptide hormone. Now, the job of all of these is to maintain homeostasis. And this is another key term dredging up from a much earlier chapter. Homeostasis is defined as the ability of an organism to maintain constant internal conditions. So, whatever these things are structurally, their overall job is to keep things normal within the environment of the body. So to do this, these hormones participate in cell signaling. Again, hey, this may look familiar from BISC130. So this just says ligand to be very generic, but you could imagine this saying hormone instead. Hormones bind to receptors and lead to some sort of cellular response. Again, I'm being very generic here. We will look at some examples later in the chapter. So hormones are a type of ligand. They bind to receptors on or in the target cell and lead to a cell response. So let's look at a few examples of this in broad terms, how we regulate three different body processes. Let's talk about water and electrolytes. So this ties into the previous chapter. The body needs to maintain a proper balance of water and electrolytes, this just dissolved charged things, in the blood. And again, this is part of the urinary system, making sure you have the right balance of this. In order to maintain this balance, the body uses a hormone called aldosterone. And at this point, maybe you can see why there are so few figures in this chapter. A lot of the hormones involved here there's not much to visually show. It's just one thing becoming another thing, doing something, causing something else to be made. And so you can really get bogged down into the details if you try to understand very specific examples. So I know it's sort of frustrating sometimes for me to skim over stuff and you have nothing to really sink your teeth into, but if I went through the details of this, it would be too much to sink your teeth into. So my summary, all I want to say about aldosterone is when water is low, the body produces what's called antidiuretic hormone, ADH, to stimulate water reabsorption. So yeah, when water is low, you want to reabsorb as much of that water and not pee it all out. And then here's aldosterone. When sodium levels are low, aldosterone hormone stimulates sodium reabsorption, again, in the kidneys. So to make sure you have a normal amount, a homeostasis of sodium, this hormone is going to make sure it gets reabsorbed when levels are low. So these are just two examples of hormones involved in the balance of water and electrolytes. Another thing that needs to be regulated by hormones is reproductive systems, male and female. Reproductive systems need to be regulated. In one way they are regulated is through something called follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. Yes, there are a lot of abbreviations in this chapter. So follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the maturation of sperm or egg cells. So this is involved in males and females. And one that is female specific, obviously, is luteinizing hormone triggers ovulation. So again, here's a figure that doesn't show anything visually interesting, just kind of shows these hormones, where they are produced, and how they act on organs that are distant in the body. So you should be familiar with FSH and with LH, at least in these simplified terms on this slide. The third example has to do with glucose levels. So this is another aspect of homeostasis. Levels of glucose in the bloodstream need to be regulated. Obviously, you need some glucose in the bloodstream. That's how you transport nutrients throughout the body. But too much of it is really bad. And obviously, too little of it is also really bad. These are both harmful. So again, delicate balance. So after a meal, your glucose levels are obviously going to rise. Remember, a couple of chapters ago, these nutrients that are absorbed in the small intestine are being absorbed into the bloodstream. So after you eat a meal, of course, you're going to have an increase in glucose levels. The hormone insulin stimulates the uptake of glucose. So glucose is removed from the bloodstream and stored in the form of glycogen. Here's the polysaccharide glycogen. Oh, here's another zoomed out view of glycogen. But it's removed from the bloodstream to form glycogen in the liver or the muscles, so that levels of glucose in the bloodstream don't get too high. So that's after a meal. Insulin stimulates the uptake of glucose. But between meals, you have the exact opposite problem. If you're fasting, if you haven't eaten in a while, glucose levels are going to start to get low because all the cells in your body are consuming the glucose or taking the glucose up from the bloodstream. So now the partner to insulin, the counterpoint, the hormone glucagon, stimulates the breakdown of glucose from glycogen in the muscles and in the liver. So breaking down this big polysaccharide into its little individual glucose units to resupply the blood with glucose when levels are low. So both of these are sort of going back and forth, insulin, glucagon, having their effects on the body in between meals and after meals. And again, this very kind of boring, uninteresting figure, but this is the best figure to sort of show the relationship between these two hormones. I apologize, this just is not a very visually stimulating chapter. So these were three examples about hormones, working properly, whether it was in regulation of reproductive systems or regulation of the kidneys or regulation of glucose in the bloodstream. But sometimes it doesn't always go the way it's supposed to. So improper function of hormones can definitely lead to disease. I have just one example of this I want to look at, diabetes mellitus type 1. So I actually brought this up very briefly a few chapters ago when we were talking about immune system. Type 1 diabetes is actually an example of an autoimmune disease. So there are beta cells in the pancreas that are supposed to be producing insulin, but due to autoimmunity, your body attacks and destroys these specific cells, so your body is not making enough insulin. So diabetes mellitus type 1 is reduced production of this hormone insulin. If you remember, insulin was involved in making sure that glucose is removed from the bloodstream. And so blood glucose levels get dangerously high in the absence of insulin, and that has a variety of negative effects. Don't memorize all this, but a variety of negative effects on the brain, on the respiration, on the digestion, and urinary. I think this one's glucose in urine. I've never experienced this, but apparently one of the symptoms diagnostic of untreated diabetes mellitus type 1 is sweet-smelling urine. Remember, glucose was one of those things that was filtered out in the urinary system and then supposed to be reabsorbed. But if you have really high levels of glucose in the bloodstream due to diabetes, some of it's going to end up in the urine, and so sweet smelling urine. So anyway, blood glucose levels get dangerously high, and this has a lot of negative effects. And so again, this one hormone not working, not being produced in the right quantities, and so having a ton of negative effects on the overall physiology. Now, regulation. So this is another thing that gets really complicated going into some of the details. So I'm going to skip the details and instead err on the side of being maybe a little bit more abstract instead of being on the side of way too detail focused. So, okay, wall of text here. I hate to do this, but wall of text here. Production of most hormones is controlled by what's called negative feedback. So most hormones need to do their job to an extent and then stop doing their job. They're trying to maintain homeostasis. They're trying to maintain a balance. So most hormones stop by stopping themselves. So the effects of the hormone result in less of it being produced. So it shuts itself down. That's what negative feedback is. And then when the effects of that hormone lessen, more of it is produced. So it turns itself off, and then it comes back on, and then it turns itself off, and it comes back on. This is a back and forth. It seems wasteful, but this is an effective way to maintain the concentration of glucose or whatever it is. I'm being generic here in these statements. This maintains a concentration of whatever you're regulating within a narrow range. So the turning itself off and then coming back on, that's negative feedback. Now, we've talked about these hormones and what they do, but where do they actually come from? Well, they come from various endocrine glands, and this is not as centralized as any of the other systems we have talked about. In fact, it's really spread across the body, different organs or different glands that produce these hormones. And it's a huge list. So hypothalamus, pituitary, different parts of the pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, different parts of the adrenal glands, pancreas, pineal gland, testes and ovaries. We're not going to memorize these tables, but there are a lot of different endocrine glands that make a lot of different hormones that do a lot of different things. My summary of all of this is as follows. Most hormones are produced by the brain, various parts. The pancreas, so double duty. Not only is it making pancreatic juices involved in the digestive system, it's producing hormones as well. The adrenal glands, which are oddly enough located on top of the kidneys, and the thyroid, which is located in front of the trachea in the throat. So these are the four I want you to be familiar with. Most hormones produced by the brain, pancreas in the abdominal cavity, adrenal glands above the kidneys, or thyroid in front of the trachea. That's a good enough summary, I think, for an intro course. And because I've glossed over the horrible details of so much of this chapter, that's actually it for this chapter. That's all I have, and this is also the last chapter of the quarter. So I know this recorded lecture is a fair deal shorter than any of the others. It hasn't stopped me from having an exam number 5 with a normal number of questions on it, so it's not going to be a freakishly short exam. I managed to cover enough material in just a shorter amount of time, I suppose. So this is the end of recorded lecture 5.5, and this, at the end of this chapter, this is the cutoff of material for exam number 5.